Okay, guys, I think we're going to get started. Thank you all so much for coming. We at Columbia Effective Altruism and One for the World are thrilled to host Elie Hassenfeld for this evening. Elie was actually a former undergrad at Columbia University, so these halls are apparently achingly familiar to him. Then after that, he went and spent 3 years working for a hedge fund in Connecticut. And during that time, he and a few colleagues set up what was called a charity club, the aim of which was essentially to make more informed giving decisions. And off the back of it, Elie and a colleague, Holden Karnofsky, decided to set up a company that would effectively offer financial analyst services to donors. That organization is GiveWell, and in the 10 years it's been in operation, it has grown exponentially and is one of the most respected and innovative charity evaluators. So I don't want to tread on his talk anymore, but please give a big warm welcome to Elie.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thankfully, I was saying before, we're in this room. If we were upstairs where I almost failed calculus, I don't think I'd be able to carry on with this talk. So GiveWell, the group that I co-founded, we do in-depth research on charities to help donors decide where to give. And we got started when I was working at a hedge fund after graduating college. And after being there for a few years, a few friends and I said, we are making more than we need to just pay the costs that we have. And so we wanted to give to charity. And we wanted to get the most bang for our buck. We wanted to get as much impact as possible with the donations that we were giving. And when we looked for information that could help us make those decisions well, we found very little information available. So this is back in 2006. We found information that told us how much charities spend on overhead versus programs. So what portion of their money goes to the programs they're trying to run. We also talked to charities and asked them questions about their activities. So I, at the time, was really interested in the cause of clean water in Africa. And I called up a bunch of organizations to ask them about what they were doing. And they tended to respond with marketing slogans like $20 provides a water to a child for life. But when we asked them, what that meant, how do you know if the water actually stays clean that the kids are drinking, and how do you know that the wells stay in good repair, they really didn't have answers to the questions that we were asking. And so after doing this work part-time for several months and finding that there was really very little information available to answer the types of questions that we had, and then also finding ourselves, out of this group of friends that were researching these questions part-time, two of us found ourselves really passionate about the research that we were doing. So when I was working in finance, I actually loved my job. It was a great place to work, but I never found myself interested in learning about the bond markets on the weekends. On the weekends, I really wanted to do something else. All of a sudden, when I started researching charities, I was up at 3 in the morning reading papers about diarrhea in Africa. And at that point, I really knew that this was the sort of thing that I wanted to get more involved in. We also learned that individual donors in the US, so people who are in the position that I was in 10 years ago, give the vast majority of charitable donations. So individuals give about 75% of total charitable giving in the United States, and just don't have the information that they need to make great decisions. And I knew that because that was the sort of information that I was looking for. And so in 2007, I left my job with a coworker, and we set up GiveWell as a full-time project. And its aim was really just to create this sort of resource that we were looking for when we were working in the private sector. And so just very briefly tonight, what I would like to do is just tell you a little bit more about why we exist, what we do, how we're different, and ultimately what we're trying to accomplish. So, in brief, what GiveWell offers is a very short list of top charities that we believe do a significant amount of good and are high performing in our core criteria, which I'll go into more depth on later, but in brief they're evidence of effectiveness, so how do we know that the program really works? Cost effectiveness, how much bang do you get for your buck? What we call room for more funding, which is how well they can use the additional funds that they'll take in, and then transparency, will they share that information with us? Because of this criterion of cost effectiveness, we focus entirely on organizations working in the poorest parts of the world. And again, happy to tell you a little bit more about that later on. We as an organization sort of are trying to do what we ask others to do, and so we are highly transparent. And what I mean by that is virtually anything that I'll say to you tonight, if you want to go and do more research or understand why I'm saying that or where that comes from, you can find more information about it on our website. And so you don't just have to take my word for it. And just finally, in terms of how we work as an organization, we are an independently funded nonprofit. So we're not asking the charities that we review to support our operations, and we don't ask donors to give to us when they give. Instead, the donations that we get that support our work come from donors who want to see more and better information about charitable giving out in the world. So I do want to tell you more about our criteria and some of the organizations we recommend. But I want to tell you just a very brief story first about the type of organization that I think is all too common and why GiveWell's research is necessary. And so this is an organization that is called a play pump. And I think it sounds like some of you might be familiar with the story, but I think it's a really good one to illustrate the need for an organization like GiveWell. So the play pump was an invention that combined a merry-go-round with a water pump. And the idea was that by installing a play pump in a poor community in East Africa, we would be providing children with a toy to play on. But at the same time as they were playing on this merry-go-round, it was pumping water and storing it in a water tank so the community would have access to water. And so this is the sort of idea that I think in many ways it sounds like a great idea. It's win-win. It provides kids with a toy, and it also provides a community with water. And so you can see this is sort of the picture that you'd normally see in the marketing materials. Lots of kids playing happily on the play pump. So years ago, an engineer went to Malawi, and he was working on water programs. And so he took that first picture. And then he sort of walked away from the play pump, and he took this picture. And I don't know if any of you have traveled, but in many places, you pull out your camera, and the kids will gather around you. And so he started to wonder, are the kids playing on the play pump when the camera is not around, or are they following the camera and posing for a picture? And if you sort of look at the top there in the picture, you can see a very tiny image of what's happening on the play pump when the camera is not focused on it. And zooming in a bit, you can see all of a sudden the kids aren't really playing on the play pump, and instead you just see a few women who are pushing this play pump all by themselves. And so this got this engineer to start asking the question of, well, is the play pump, really doing more good than if it weren't there? And he found out that when the organization came in, they had replaced the existing hand pumps with these play pumps. And they thought that this was a great idea because, if you have the play pump and it's working and it's pumping water, what need does anyone have for the existing hand pumps? But the play pumps weren't, the hand pumps, the play pumps weren't being used in the way that the organization had intended. And so he tried to figure out how long would it, given that everyone had to use this play pump to pump their water. And when he talked to people in the village, what they told him was that they were pushing this play pump by themselves to pump water. How hard was it for the villagers that this organization was trying to help to access water now? And so he put this video up on YouTube that you can go see where he tried to pump himself a bucket of water using the play pump. And if you watch it, it'll take him about 3 full minutes. He's a fit 25-year-old guy, and at the end he's drenched in sweat and out of breath to get himself his bucket of water. So 3 minutes of hard work. Then he stands up next to the old style, sort of ugly but certainly functional hand pump, and 30 seconds later he has a big bucket of water. And I think this, to me, is such a great illustration of why an organization like GiveWell is helpful and what can go wrong in its absence. The people who started and ran play pumps were well-intentioned. They were trying to help people in the poorest parts of the world. But they didn't have any mechanism for checking whether or not their program was actually having the effect that they intended. And the play pump was not some small unknown organization. It won a World Bank Development Award. It was announced at the Clinton Global Initiative, got funding from the US government and others. This was an organization that in 2007 and 2008 was really held up as an example of an outstanding development program. And so, the play pump is very much the type of organization that GiveWell's criteria are trying to avoid. And we're not really trying to find examples like the play pump. Instead, we're trying to use these criteria to find the very best giving opportunities that we can. So our first criterion is evidence. How do we know that this program is working and how much impact is it really having? I think the best or a great example of why this is necessary is the program of microfinance. Microfinance is the practice of providing small loans and other financial services to very poor people in the developing world. And this is a program that 15 years ago was seen as something of a panacea for poverty. The story was you give a person a small loan, they can use it to invest in a business, they can then use the investment returns from that business to pull themselves out of poverty. And that story was told based on anecdotes and some evidence that was just not as rigorous in trying to assess the effects of the program. 5 years later, a group at MIT ran randomized control trials of microfinance programs. So those are the way that we evaluate a medical measure to see whether or not it's effective, where we take two groups of people, we randomly assign them to one group or the other, and the only difference between them is whether or not they get the program. And when they ran the more rigorous assessments of microfinance, they found that it didn't have nearly as large an effect as they had previously thought. I think it still probably does a great deal of good, but a more rigorous assessment of the impact provides a much clearer view of how much the impact the program is actually having. On the flip side, a program like distributing malaria nets to protect against the mosquitoes that transmit malaria in Africa, there's more than 20 randomized control trials that show that mosquito nets effectively prevent mosquitoes from biting, reduce cases of malaria, and reduce deaths from malaria among adults and children. And so, there are huge differences in how much impact charities have when you look at this, when you ask the question of what the evidence is for the effect of the program. Our second criterion is cost effectiveness. And so this is saying, how much impact do you have for every dollar that you spend? In a lot of the work that we do, what we're trying to do is come to the best, I'd say, quantitative estimate of what a charity is accomplishing. Now, there's really no way in charity to answer this question of sort of objectively speaking, how much good does a charity do? Because some charities try to save lives, some charities try to improve lives, some charities try to improve education, and so there are so many different types of good that there's no way that we can easily quantify this difference. But this criterion is one that we focus on as much as we can, and we really do everything we can to model the differences in impact that charities have. And so one of the things that we see even among our top charities is that we think the most cost-effective top charities that we recommend are more than 10 times as cost-effective as other groups that are even on our list. Never mind other groups in the world that we haven't reviewed or we haven't seen as good evidence for. The sort of third criterion that is very important for us is utilizing additional funding, or room for more funding. And this is important because it is not always the case. Charities sometimes are not able to use additional funds effectively. So just to give one example of a case that we saw, there are organizations that will raise money to pay surgeons to perform surgeries in developing countries. So these could be cataract correction surgeries or other congenital deformities. And one of the problems that they can have is there can be a limited supply or a limited number of surgeons and then a limited number of hours in the day for those surgeons to perform these surgeries. And in some of the organizations that we talked to several years ago, it was clear that they just couldn't take more money and turn it into more surgeries because they had exhausted the surgical capacity that was available in that country. And there's certainly a lot more that can be done to build up surgical capacity, to educate people. But understanding that it helped us to understand that the marginal impact of that additional donation to the organization wasn't going to just be more of what they had done in the past, because they had really run out of the available capacity to do the program that they were trying to implement. And then the final criterion that we look at is transparency. Most of the information we rely on, it's not publicly available. It tends to come from individual organizations that have to be willing to share that information with us. And so we need organizations that are ready, willing, and able to share that information to enable us to do our work. And so with these criteria, these are the groups that we recommended, or we currently recommend. There are 9 of them, and they distribute malaria nets, they provide malaria treatment, they treat children for parasitic infections that are incredibly common in developing countries. One of them, Helen Keller International, provides vitamin A supplementation, which reduces child mortality. Another provides a small loan, which encourages and incentivizes people to migrate in Bangladesh during the what's called the lean season. When they have very little work at home, they temporarily migrate to cities and then come back after the lean season is over to do more agricultural work. And then finally, Give Directly, which just gives cash to the various poorest people in the world, with the idea that often the people themselves know more about how to help themselves than we would sitting here 7,000 miles away. So most of what I've talked about so far is how GiveWell got started, how we work, what our criteria are, and the charities we recommend. One of the other goals that we have is to support the development of future GiveWell top charities. In order for us to recommend a charity, there needs to be strong research demonstrating that the program is effective. The organization needs to have high quality monitoring to demonstrate that its programs are working as intended. Someone else had to come and provide funding to the organization to allow it to get off the ground before it had any sort of monitoring or track record. And as part of our incubation grants program, we've directed funding to organizations that are not meeting the GiveWell criteria today, but with some additional funding, we think they might be in a position to do so. So one example is a group that now is a GiveWell top charity, the organization No Lean Season, and they're the one that does the seasonal migration program that I just mentioned. When I first heard about the research that showed that providing these loans can encourage people to migrate and earn significantly more money than they otherwise would, it was really just an academic paper that no one was taking forward and building into an organization. But together with GiveWell via this incubation program, professor at Yale, Mushfiq Mubarak, and then an organization, Evidence Action, together we built this program, No Lean Season, which is now operating at great scale in Bangladesh. And so, one way that our incubation program is intended to work is to help researchers and organizations find programs that they can scale up that meet our criteria. Other types of grants that we've made in the incubation program include grants to an organization focused on immunization in Nigeria to get off the ground, and a partnership with a research organization to do additional research on some of the programs we recommend to test how effective they are in practice. Now, a lot of what we've been talking about is GiveWell's research, and we only want to do the research to the extent that it can affect how donors give. And so, in our history, over the last few years, we've moved approximately $100 million a year to the charities we recommend. And these are donors who have told us or told the charities that they're giving directly to these organizations as a direct result of the research that we do. And this sort of metric of our what we call our money moved is one of the core ways that GiveWell evaluates itself. And just very briefly want to kind of talk about where I think we're going. So, I think in many ways, what we want to do is just continue on with the work that we've done in the past. So we want to find more outstanding organizations that meet our criteria. We're hoping to grow our incubation program. Last year we gave about $13 million to groups as part of the incubation program, but we think there's a lot of room for growth in that part of our work to help groups become GiveWell top charities. The two other big sort of new areas of work, the first is, GiveWell's core goal is to find the most cost-effective giving opportunities that we can that meet our criteria. And historically, that has mostly meant looking for organizations that have, sort of the gold standard of evidence demonstrating their impact. And what that has tended to mean is groups that have randomized controlled trials or programs that have randomized controlled trials that demonstrate that their programs are actually having an effect. But there's a lot of programs that charities run that could be extremely cost effective. So they could get an extreme impact with donations given that are not going to have that type of evidence behind them. And I think the sort of two of the examples that seem most promising to us, the first is what I'd call policy-oriented philanthropy in developing countries. So, if you can, what GiveWell has done to date is recommended groups that give out malaria nets or give out deworming pills. Instead, if you can convince the country government to implement the program itself, you can get a lot more leverage because they have significantly more funds that they can bring to bear on the problem. So I think like a good example of the type of program that we are looking at and we need to do more research on is tobacco taxation. So we know from the experience of richer countries that tobacco taxes reduce tobacco use. Tobacco taxation is being worked on in many poorer countries, but it's by no means rolled out in every place. And the public health burden of tobacco use is very high. And so we're trying to look at organizations that could potentially have an effect on this outcome of tobacco taxation and then reducing tobacco use. Now this is going to be a lot harder for us to evaluate, and what we're going to aim to do is bring to bear the same approach and transparency that we have in our research in the past to this research and recommendations. The sort of final area of growth at GiveWell is not on the research side, but it's on the the outreach side. So we both want to do the highest quality research that we can, and then we also want to move as much money as possible to the recommendations that we make. GiveWell's been around for about 10 years, and in that time, we've done very little to proactively raise more money for our recommendations. But now it's something that we are very focused on, and we're in GiveWell's future, we're really planning to build out that outreach function, that I guess that marketing team to try and maximize the amount of money that we direct to charities. And we do that with I guess primarily two goals in mind. So the first goal is just a very sort of proximate near-term goal of directing as much money as possible to the best organizations we can find, because that alone will do a lot of good. But longer term, we really want to create the incentive for organizations to get funding based on demonstrated effectiveness. And I think this is actually one of the biggest problems in the charitable sector. If you're a business and you fail to make money, you go out of business because you haven't delivered what the customers want. Unfortunately, in the charity world, the people who fund the organization's existence are entirely divorced from the beneficiaries of that organization's program. And that means that an organization can grow to be very large without anyone ever knowing whether or not the program is effective. And so we're trying to grow this pool of funds for charities to be as large as possible, because we envision this world where instead of donors giving to charities based on slogans and pictures and the emotional pull, instead donors reward charities for their effectiveness in improving lives. And we think that structural change in how the charitable sector work could ultimately have the biggest impact possible. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take whatever questions.
So in terms of the public health concern and a tobacco tax, which I absolutely love, the public health concern surrounding meat and animal agriculture. Obviously, I know that animal charity evaluators exist and they direct people to farm animal advocacy, but a lot of times that focuses on the message of compassion as compared to the message of public health, that our healthcare system is overburdened by obesity, diabetes, etc. Has it more just been a thought that animal charity evaluators kind of have that field covered, or is it something that GiveWell has ever considered?
Yeah, so just for people in the back who may not have heard, I mean, the question is, has GiveWell thought about looking at animal welfare organizations? In the case of animal welfare organizations specifically, I think GiveWell is very unlikely to look at them because of the existence of two other organizations that focus on animal welfare that I think are very aligned with GiveWell in their methodology and attitude. So there's a group called Animal Charity Evaluators, which was, I think, essentially started to be like the GiveWell for animal charities. And they very much have the same sort of mindset and ethos that GiveWell does. There's also a funder called the Open Philanthropy Project that actually was incubated at and grew out of GiveWell, and it has a big program run by Program Officer Lewis Ballard, who himself is very aligned with sort of the GiveWell attitude and ethos and approach. And so I think that in the absence of those two entities, GiveWell would consider it, but I think in this, given that they exist, I don't think we have very much to add in that domain.
Yeah, I guess I'm more considering it from the public health standpoint, where they're not, like Animal Charity Evaluators is not recommending anything in that regard, but yeah, they do.
So I mean, the way that we work is we would say, we have this sort of giant spreadsheet that has 400 programs that we could consider looking at, and then we try to rank them based on how well we think they will meet our criteria. And so, we would take something like animal welfare to, accomplish X goal in public health, and just compare it to those other ones. And if it was high enough on the list, we would definitely look at it. All the way in back, yeah, right there.
You said that 75% of charitable contributions come from individuals. Do you approximately know the breakdown of, is it mostly rich people giving vast amounts of money versus large sums of small individual donations?
I don't know that off the top of my head, sorry.
And for you guys?
So for us, about 2/3 of our, go back to this slide. So this shows our money moved by year. Roughly 2/3 of the money that we move comes from one funder. They're a foundation called Good Ventures, which was set up by Carrie Tuna and Dustin Moskovitz. Dustin is one of the co-founders of Facebook. Even in the remaining third, that is also fairly top heavy. So about 2/3 of that comes from donors giving $10,000 or more. And then there's roughly 500 people like that who give 2/3 of the remaining third, and then there's another almost 20,000 donors who make up the remainder. And so I should say, we are a group that, whether you're Good Ventures giving, last year they gave 75, in 2017 they gave $75 million to our recommendations, you're a donor giving $100,000, or the donor who gives $10, basically each of them get the same research and then get the same impact. And, because what we're largely offering is a website with information, it doesn't affect us how much they're giving. On this side.
Yeah, you mentioned that, I think it was No Try Season. The idea for that came from an academic paper. So I'm just wondering, how much does academic research, particularly in development economics, which I think deals with a lot of the same stuff, how much does that inform your choice of charities versus your own research? And do you think there's does that interface work well between academia and charity evaluators, and are there ways to improve it?
Yeah. Okay. So the program is no lean season, and it was heavily reliant on academic research. Academic research is just a huge part of our process. It's actually where we start because we see much bigger. So first of all, most charities just do not have very compelling information about whether or not their programs are effective. And so if you go to the average charity and you say, like, how do you know that your program works? They won't be able to share very much with you. And that's understandable. Doing high quality research is really expensive. And so we tend to start with academic research. And so in our sort of first starting point is saying, what we call interventions should we look at? And so that could be malaria nets, regardless of which organization is the one implementing that program. And we review that evidence, and it's only after we've reviewed the evidence and a program seems promising that we go look for charities that are actually implementing that program and look for the data that they have. So that part of the process works very well. I think the biggest challenge that we've seen is the case that I mentioned with no lean season, where this professor at Yale, Mushfiq Mubarak, did research on seasonal migration, and then that became an organization that was raising money and trying to scale and help people is very much the exception, rather than the rule. In most cases, academic research is not as interested in answering the questions that we have as the questions that I think are interesting to academics. So just to give like one concrete example, we recommend this program deworming, and there's a huge debate in the academic community about how effective deworming programs really are. And for us, one of the pieces of research we would most like to see is another study that evaluates whether or not deworming has the effect that we are interested in. But I think that when we've talked to academics about the possibility, they are not interested in it because it's sort of a large-scale study where I think they don't see a lot of personal benefit in running the 15th study of a deworming program, and I think we are the only plausible funder for that research to take place. And so I think that academia does a lot. We rely on it heavily, but it's often not asking the questions that we would find most helpful in our research. Yeah, on the side.
I would love to hear more detail about the values that inform your decisions or the assumptions that constrain them. So for example, are you risk neutral or risk averse, or are you assuming if your donors are you assuming they have certain opinions about the value of future lives compared to present lives, this type of thing?
Yeah, so that's a really great question and a really hard one to answer like very, very briefly. Sure. So the question is, what values inform GiveWell's decisions? And in many ways, there's no single set of values that inform our decisions because individual staff members whose opinions matter to our ultimate recommendations have different opinions about some of the values that are most important. There are some values that I think are shared across, GiveWell as an institution. So I think, broadly speaking, we are, more utilitarian and consequentialist in our mindset than something else. And so we're saying, we are trying to quantify how much good can be done and compare good on one hand to good on the other. We see all lives as having equal value, whether they're, or I should say, at least all human lives as having equal value, whether those lives are, here in the United States or, abroad in some of the poorest parts of the country. But for some of the questions that you're asking, how do we value the lives of the people, the lives of people alive today versus the people who may exist in the distant future, that is not something that is settled. And if you're interested in really getting into the weeds on this question, if you go to our website, we have a model of our cost effectiveness estimates. And this is trying to say, how much good does this charity accomplish for each dollar given? And if you click through to an inordinate amount of depth, you can see different staff members' explanations for how they make the sort of trade-off that you're describing. Yeah, right here.
So I'm noticing on your website that one of your features is give to charities at GiveWell's discretion on your donate page.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about that process? Is that just you giving to your home charities, or do have a different process behind that?
Yeah, I mean, basically, like we now say to donors, like if you know us and you trust us, we recommend just giving into a pot of funds that we then distribute on a quarterly basis to the recommended charity of ours that we think has the most pressing needs for funds. We do this because charities' funding gaps can change over time, and what we want to do is be able to provide the organization with the money when it will do them the most good. So we just went through this process where we were re-granting the funds that we received at the end of 2017 to one of our recommendations. And we had said at the end of the year, our recommended allocation for people who want to follow our research is 70% to one of our charities called the Against Malaria Foundation and 30% to another called the Schistosomiasis Control Initiative. But in the course of the last few months, SCI raised less money than we expected, and AMF had more money than we expected. And so we just allocated, the roughly $5.5 million that we had received to SCI because, we thought that money was going to do them the most good right now. And we're going to be publishing a post about that sometime later this week. In the corner.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of the career path that got you to the position you're in now, and then if you had sort of any advice for college students looking to work in economic development.
Yeah, so I have a really weird career path. I was a religion major here, and then I went to work in finance, and then I went to work in charity. So I think what mostly drove me throughout college and then in my career was, just allowing myself to focus on what was most interesting to me at the time. In hindsight, I wish I'd taken more economics and statistics classes in college, so it doesn't always work, but that really was what drove me, was just allowing that interest to take me where it did. In terms of economic development, there are a ton of organizations that do amazing work and have opportunities for students, like the Innovations for Poverty Action, the Poverty Action Lab. Beyond that, there are like online courses. The Poverty Action Lab has a micro master's program, which I think is really great in terms of getting up to speed on economic development. And then I know the thing that I always look for in thinking about who might be, a really strong analyst at GiveWell is seeing people who are independently trying to do the work that we're trying to do. And so what I mean by that is last year we hired someone who had spent, had been trying to write a review and make a recommendation for something that he thought we had missed, like the best organization that we hadn't recommended. And he basically sent it forward and said, I'm applying for a job, but I also think you should really recommend this organization because they're outstanding. And that's something that, we always find like incredibly compelling when someone has had that, independent interest to do the work on their own. Right behind you, yeah.
So you touched on the end on like how you changing the basis for which people give donations, be more focused on like the effectiveness of the charities themselves. I guess my question is, like speaking to a room full of college undergraduates mostly, how does that change begin to happen in your mind?
So, I think at the end of the day, we need to incentivize charitable organizations to behave differently. And right now, donors are part of the problem more than they are part of the solution. So when donors say like, spend less on overhead, don't invest in good people, we want to see lower salaries, and they don't ask for a demonstration of impact, what they're creating in the charity is the incentive to just do things the same way and often in a suboptimal way. And so what we hope, the message we hope to send to donors generally is, in large part, overhead is good. It helps invest in good people, good infrastructure, good technology. But if you're going to give, try to focus on what matters rather than these things that don't. And then on our part, just trying to make the pool of money that GiveWell has some degree of responsibility for allocating, make that as large as possible, because then we can directly create the incentives or create the dynamic that we want to see in the charitable sector. Right here. Yep, right there in the back.
One piece of your talk I thought was really interesting was talking about RCTs are really expensive. right? It's not that a charity always is not interested in measuring their impact, but they might not have $100,000 to loan, and they might be applying for those grants and just not getting them. I think there's a lot of politics and stuff to that whole grant giving process. Can you talk more about what you guys are doing to help kind of change that paradigm, and then what other organizations you see out there that are helping to also make RCTs a bit more accessible for organizations to figure out how to fund, how to manage?
Yeah, totally. So that's a great question. I mean, RCTs are incredibly expensive. So, I mean, I think first and foremost, the question is the RCT the right approach to measurement or not? I think the sort of worst type of evaluation that we've seen are the evaluations that cost a lot, but are not set up to give the organizations or the funders the answers that they need. And so, what we're just in the research that we do, trying to really focus and push for the right type of research at the right time, so that the right type of research is done. Through the incubation program that we have, we're trying to fund RCTs. So, there's an organization I mentioned that, is doing a conditional cash transfer program to increase immunization rates in Nigeria. And, as part of that program, we provided the funding for a randomized controlled trial to see what amount of effect they can have on the immunization rate. And more broadly, like we're just trying to play that part of contributing money where it can be helpful to push that ahead. I do think this is a gap that has not really been filled. In helping organizations do high quality evaluation, the group that we've worked with most closely that is amazing and also has opportunities for people like looking for jobs post college is a group called ID Insight. And they're essentially an academic evaluation group that is unaffiliated with any academic institution, and so all the people who work there are very much focused on trying to do evaluations that are serving some decision maker, a funder, a policymaker, or the head of an organization about what sort of program to run and how to run it most effectively. But they're really, at least now, the only organization that I know of that I think is doing that sort of work really effectively. Yeah, right here.
Great, thanks. You've already talked a little bit more about this new focus on kind of donor outreach, but I'm wondering, given the percentage of the money that you move that comes from a particular very, very, very wealthy donor, is the approach to try to get more of those sort of like super rich folks to be donors, or to cultivate a kind of bigger movement, and there's effective altruism on the wall, like to the kind of broader movement of effective altruism? How do you folks see yourself within that, and how does that inform your outreach strategy?
Yeah, so I mean, we're going to be writing a lot more about the outreach strategy, so there'll be a lot of detail. I mean, in very brief, I'd just say, we're planning to do a lot of experimentation and see what works. Last year we ran a bunch of ads on podcasts, just because like some of us on staff felt like we heard those ads in ways that we didn't hear any other ads. We saw like amazing returns. We saw people who came and donated to our top charities and learned about GiveWell via that podcast, and so we're going to do more of that. But that's just one idea, and so we're going to do a lot of experimentation to see what works. We're based in San Francisco, and one of the things that's really great is that the growth and marketing community out there is very metrics driven. And so, a lot of the people that we're engaging with and trying to figure out how to grow as effectively as possible, very much speak our language of experimentation and data driven decisions. Yeah.
I'm curious, so what kinds of causes that don't work as well with your metrics driven approach? For example, whether it's social change or education, where the results really don't come through for decades, or one result is tied to so many other factors in the community. Do you avoid those charities, or do you eventually anticipate creating a different kind of model?
Yeah, so we definitely have avoided those types of causes historically because they're much more challenging for a model. So, the social change organization, the hard to quantify, hard to attribute impact type of program, our aspiration long term is to say, really there's nothing that is inherently off the table for GiveWell. The reason we did things the way that we did is when we started, we were just like two 25-year-old finance guys who knew nothing about charity. And so we said, what comparative advantage do we have? Well, basically none. Like, we can look at data and see whether or not the data shows what we think it might. But now we've been doing this for 10 years, and we want to try and sort of grow the scope of things that we consider as much as possible. The big challenge that this leads to is it's just much harder to articulate the case for the harder to measure, harder to attribute program in a way that is really verifiable and falsifiable to the general public. So, someone can look at our recommendations in malaria or deworming, they can point out mistakes that we've made. I could tell you like exactly what I could see in each case that would cause us to change our mind and stop recommending that program. And that's the bar that's the reason that the softer causes are much more difficult. We in order for us to work on those in a way that would be consistent with our mission and our goals, we'd have to be able to say, here's exactly what we need to see that would change our minds, and here's why we believe these organizations are worth supporting, without just appealing to our judgment or our expertise. And so that's the challenge that we have to overcome. I think it's going to be a really slow process. So I don't think you'll see a bunch of social change organizations on the GiveWell website in the near future. But we're slowly starting to move in this direction with some of the research into newer areas like policy-oriented philanthropy. Yeah.
What's more effective, giving 10% of your income every year, or earmarking 10%, putting it in an index fund, assuming you will never be that actually involved? Giving that self.
Yeah. So just for the people, in case you didn't hear, like, what's more effective, giving 10% of your income every year, or putting 10% of your income in an index fund and then letting that grow for a while and then giving? I mean, there's obviously no obvious answer to that question, because it all depends on what the returns are to your investment. It depends on what social return, in a sense, you think you're getting from the underlying donation. As a general rule, I'd say a few things. I think first, you learn a lot by giving and having the experience of giving and seeing what went right and wrong. So, I know the first charitable donations that I made, it caused me to want to get more engaged and follow up on them more closely. And I think there's a real benefit to having that experience. Beyond that, I don't, and there's also the benefit of you said subject to not reneging. I think there's like a real danger of reneging when you don't sort of force that commitment. But in the absence of that, I think it's a tough call for people to make. And in general, the reason I think that there is potentially some, pretty big social return for most people is that I do think, generally speaking, the world is getting better. So, child mortality is falling, poverty is falling, and some of the programs that, 20 years ago had really big funding gaps, like immunization or vitamin A supplementation, have much smaller funding gaps today. And so in some ways, by holding money, you gain the ability to give more later and learn more, but you also lose the opportunity to help now when the needs are really great. Yeah, in the back.
Elie, did I understand correctly that you said that you're working on giving policy or doing research to give policy recommendations to, say, the governments in the countries that you're working in? Is that what? Yeah. So we're trying to explore these causes that are harder to attribute impact to, but could be very impactful. So there's a blog post that you can find on our website about a recent grant we made to an organization that's working on. So we wouldn't do the policy advising, but the organization itself is trying to gather data that can be helpful to the governments in India and Nepal in a decision that they're trying to make. And then we've talked to other groups in other areas about how they could use funding to influence policy. There's a follow-up question on that.
Yeah.
What would you respond to critics who ask the IMF, the World Bank, they failed for 50 years on trying to give policy recommendations, and they're supposedly the leaders in the world who are trying to give these recommendations? What would you say to the critics who say, why don't we give African leaders a chance to come up with policies from home, because they ultimately are the ones who should be understanding their problems the best? Yeah, so totally. So I think you should think about the type of
like support that these organizations would give, less as sort of like lobbying for some change that we're sure is the right one, and more like the legislative subsidy model of lobbying, where you're providing some degree of support and data to policymakers to enable them to make better decisions. And so you're saying, so to give this concrete example, and I apologize if this is a sensitive topic, but the group that we gave funding to is called the Center for Pesticide Suicide Prevention. And basically you have people in agricultural economies who often have very easy access to pesticide in their home. And the country of Sri Lanka had this, saw this dramatic drop in suicides after they passed legislation that restricted the pesticides that were the most poisonous to humans. And so this organization is run by an academic at the University of Edinburgh, and all that he is trying to do is go out and gather data about what pesticides are available and how lethal they are, and then share that with the pesticide registrar in the country. And I think like that's more of the model you should have in mind when you're thinking about the type of organization we're most likely to support or the type of activity that they're most likely to do. Yeah, right here.
So it seems like GiveWell does really rigorous research into how these charities help development, but has there been any analysis of how development more broadly can affect the world in ways such as contributing to animal suffering by increasing meat consumption or speeding up climate change or existential risk, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think that in many ways, like those sorts of impacts, are the ones that are at the edge of what GiveWell looks at, and we basically say like we can only go so far for practical purposes in what we look at, and are not trying to answer the question of if you give directly, and that gives a poor family more money, that will increase their meat consumption. And I think for people with certain values, that means that Give Directly is like not an organization that they would want to support. And we to date have left that consideration to the side. Yep.
You talked about sort of the administrative overhead of the charity. Can you sort of talk to your own experience being in San Francisco? Sort of a very, very expensive environment. How do you attract and retain talent for an organization like yours? For example, the starting salary, I saw your website was like $55,000 a year, which is not really much in San Francisco. How do you make sure that you get the best people?
Yeah, so we've been incredibly fortunate to have donors who've supported our operations and supported them generously, so we're able to pay people, salaries that enable them to live comfortably. We talk to our staff, so when I've talked to sort of the younger staff about the starting salary, they're fairly comfortable at that salary, but I think $55,000 a year is great, or is sufficient for many people coming right out of undergrad. Doesn't work to raise a family, and we have to keep our compensation in line with the sort of standard what the market rate is for people to work in social good opportunities in San Francisco. And so our general approach to sort of spending and compensation in general is we just want it to be a non-issue in any way. And what that means is we don't want anyone to come work at GiveWell because it's a place that they can be highly compensated, but we also don't want to lose anyone because we're not compensating them enough. That means in the scheme of things, we have to pay like fairly high salaries, but we think that's worth it to get great people to do the work that we do. Yep.
So,
Sure.
particularly in this graph, when you're looking at the resources that you sort of facilitated a better allocation towards in what are very global causes. If you're looking at the philanthropic sector in the U.S., here, assuming that most people give within the U.S. and only some donors are willing to consider causes very much far away in places like Africa and Asia, has GiveWell considered sort of adjusting the fully impact maximizing strategy of where could $1 be used
most effectively globally and sort of reduce the universe to the U.S., where a lot of, where perhaps $1 will go not as long as it could in Africa, but there's more dollars interested in being allocated in the U.S. Is there any sort of consideration there where your recommendation could potentially influence a lot of domestic philanthropists?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, it's something we've thought about. So the question was just, have we thought about extending our research to focus on other causes, especially, domestic causes in the U.S., where, even if you accepted our conclusion that the money wouldn't have as much impact, per dollar given, there might be so much money to influence that it would still be a very impactful activity to undertake. We've thought a lot about that. When GiveWell started, that was the vision we thought we were moving towards. We imagined we were going to have a menu where we recommended charities in many different causes. What we decided not to pursue that for a few reasons. One is that in our early days we saw a lot of interest in what I would say is now sort of GiveWell's core offering, which is, here's our recommendation. Do you want to use it or not? And we see a lot of interest in that. We wrote a long blog post about it back in 2010, if you're really interested in reading more about it. And we saw very little interest in this sort of mini menu that we had back then. We recommended an organization, a few organizations in the U.S. working on early childhood care and education. So one was we just didn't see a lot of interest from donors. The other is just, we as a staff, we think we do our best work when we are most interested in the research that we're doing, and I think we just need to stay motivated. And I think this was an area when we were working on it, we just found it hard to do our best research because we weren't driven by trying to answer that question as well as possible. But our hope is that there will be more groups like Animal Charity Evaluators, the group that someone mentioned earlier, that sort of taken the GiveWell model and applied it to another area. And that's really possible because we put our research online, our methodologies online. We would love to help people who are trying to start that sort of organization, just understand what we do and why. And I think that model where someone else takes the GiveWell approach and tries to apply it to another area is one that we've seen work in the past. And it's the way that I hope eventually more causes get covered in this sort of research. Okay, cool.
Great. So first of all, thanks, Elie. That was really fantastic. We're really grateful and proud of you for braving math one more time, just for us. Thanks to Doogie, Jimena, and the Columbia Effective Altruism crew, our co-hosts tonight. I'm Kenan. I'm Vice President of One for the World Columbia. We're a nonprofit group here on campus that works closely with charity evaluation organizations such as GiveWell to curate a portfolio of 19 of the highest performing charities working on various issue areas related to extreme poverty in the developing world. So if you're still following me after that, we are very interested in anyone who's curious about learning more about what Elie's talked about, curious about ways of getting involved. What we do is we offer programming like this to introduce people to the concept of effective altruism, and we encourage students to pledge 1% of their future income through our portal to this group of the highest performing charities in the world, so that today, even as a student, for example, I give $10 a year. That $10, I know it's not saving the world, but it provides safe drinking water for 10 people for an entire year. So to me, it's certainly worth a lot more whatever else I would do with that $10. So if you're interested in learning more, if you're interested in making the pledge, find one of us with a One for the World t-shirt on. We've got some pizza here in the back. Grab a slice, get to know us, ask us any questions, challenge us on our model. We'd love to hear from you, so thank you all.